Hello and welcome. Today we're going to look at accessing historical maps of Africa for research and teaching. We're going to particularly look at tips and techniques for online use and citation with the help of supporting materials developed by the Africa Map Circle. The Africa Map Circle is actually a very interesting group of people devoted to the study of African maps, looking particularly at why Africa maps matter. The African continent was arguably the first one in the world to be mapped in its full outline form. Yet Africa maps were largely created by non-Africans. Therefore, Africa maps can only be understood as multicultural documents from the get-go, from the beginning. They are multicultural documents. These maps therefore require international and multicultural teams of students and scholars to be analyzed adequately. Furthermore, now, digital technology makes it possible to share and analyze these maps around the globe. The result is that the collaborative study of Africa maps can now provide a new paradigm for international and multicultural teaching and learning. That's what the Africa Map Circle is devoted to, and you can find out more about it by joining in their activities. Simply scan in the QR code and join in. One way to get started in their activities is to get access to the historical maps in collections online. Let's take a look at some of these collections and get access to them by way of practice. There are 6 easily accessible historical map collections, starting with the Library of Congress, then the New York Public Library digital collections, with an emphasis to search on Africa. Then the Stanford University Libraries has a segment on maps of Africa. The Illinois University Library Collections has maps of Africa to 1900, so it deals with mainly the slave trade period and the scramble through the 19th century. Northwestern University Libraries have digital collections as well, dealing again from the early 16th century to the early 20th century. And finally, Afroterra, the Cartographic Free Library, is definitely worth checking out and exploring in detail. It's one of the most powerful and immediately useful online libraries in the world, and its indexing has made it possible to scan for maps and then enlarge them quite easily for use in research and in teaching. We can summarize these things, and they'll be available for you in a PDF file on the website for the Africa Map Circle. The links are there in the right-hand column. The logos are in the left, and the name of the collection is in the middle. You can download this PDF document and click on the links as a way to get going. So let's begin with the Library of Congress itself. Take a look at what they, in fact, have available on Africa, biggest library in America. Very useful collection of documents. Here you can see what the Library of Congress landing page looks like in their map section. And you can see directly that we can enter a term up here in search in the map collection, which is one of their digital collections. You can go through the different kinds of films and legislation and narrated music, all sorts of things. But if you click on maps and then put in the word Africa and then search, what you'll get back is a list of maps. In this case, 274 are available online. Now, in addition, you'll get maps from widely different periods. And it's very important to look at which period you want. Here they actually offer in the left-hand column a way of filtering this by different categories, both historically and by different categories as well as whether it's part of the Library of Congress online catalog, the Geography and Map Division, the American Memory Catalog, and the like. But for our purposes, the historical study is quite interesting because it allows us to segment very quickly and narrow down a number of maps about Africa from different periods, like from 1500 to 1599, for example. If we click on that, we'll get a sublist of the full list. It's only 11 maps, but in fact, very important early maps of Africa, including Portulans, that is, maps created by the Portuguese early on, that include maps of the Mediterranean and the coast of Africa. Here's a chart of the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and the coast of Western Europe. If you click on these, you can get through to the map images behind them and learn a lot about this earlier period. Let's go to a more recent period, not the 1500 to 1599, but 1540 to 1549. There they indicate they've got this one map, which is very fascinating because it marks one of the earliest indications about the importance of Africa on the way to Asia. This was the preoccupation, you'll recall, of the Portuguese. And in fact, one of their objectives was to find a Christian king who was reputed to be in the current state of Ethiopia, that part of Africa. And a lot of their early maps indicate that this is where that king would be found. And they gave great importance to the notion that beyond Nubia, in Ethiopia, which they called the whole continent at that point, there was a Christian king that they hoped to ally with and outflank the Arab populations that had come to dominate so much of the Mediterranean at the time. Now, this is a map that's very interesting to look at for its historical point of view, in a sense, for its historicity. And that's what can be studied here in the metadata that's provided. This was made by a cartographer who worked from 1490 to 1531. Very early on, the map was printed, published in 1541. And one of the things that they're very good at is giving you a great deal of metadata about each one of these things, including a permanent digital ID, as well as the Library of Congress call number, giving you a brief description. And down here, a very important line, which you want to look at and start learning how to use. This is called Cite This Item, and it has a plus next to it. So if you click on the plus, you can see how it is appropriate to cite this particular historical document. in either the Chicago citation style, the American Psychological Association, APA citation style, or the Modern Language Association, MLA citation style. And what you can do is take this off into your own records and keep it as a way of properly citing this map within the Library of Congress collection. Very powerful set of information, not only in the map itself, which, as I say, you can scan and pan in upon at great detail, but also the metadata, which is absolutely crucial in studying these early sources. So not only do you have access to the map, you have access to very powerful metadata about the map. This is where you could start your early study. And note how the early maps did include, over here, South America. In effect, the presence of Brazil was very early known and very directly connected to Africa at the time. Not so much the North American colonies. They're known, but not very well. And some of them are represented with kind of generic foreign presences, like as if an elephant ever were anywhere near Greenland in modern human history. Didn't happen, but it's very interesting to see how these early maps started representing exotic beings in different parts of the world. If you get out of the Africa category, you can look at some of the other early maps of other parts of the world as well. But let's take a look at some of the other Africa maps from different periods. Again, a little bit later, you can locate the time frame you want over here on the left-hand side, and in fact indicate that you want to look at a later period, and maps to 1800. This is back to the date question, and if you look prior to that period and back in the date categories that are put forward here, you can see from 1700 to 1799, or let's go back through the 1600 to 1699. This is actually a very interesting period because the Portuguese, who started the charting of Africa and subsidized explorers to go a few kilometers each year and create these very detailed porcelain maps, were eventually displaced by the Dutch, whose maritime control of the India trade made them dominant in Africa. And it's this Dutch material that starts to show up in these totalizing maps of Africa, the whole continent, not just the shores of West Africa, but the whole continent start to be represented. And you can get access to these early maps again by the same technique. Click on them, then click on this again. You can see it can be brought to a full page by going up to the right-hand corner and clipping on that. You can magnify it by going into the plus indicator, and you can hold your arrow down and scan different parts of the map as you draw it over, zooming out or zooming in. This is very powerful and an extraordinary asset in getting access to the early recognition in maps of important places in West Africa, South Africa, or East Africa, with particular detail given to islands for reasons that are well known and discussed elsewhere. Islands are very important for the Europeans in their approach to Africa. But here, Benin is indicated, And the whole coast of Guinea is given some detail. It starts here, Guinea, Guinea, and various place names are given here along the Ivory Coast and the Gold Coast, including some very particular ones that it would be worth studying in detail with African scholars who know what these place names mean. One of the real problems in studying these maps from only one cultural vantage point is that we don't know what the meaning is of these local terms and place names. We can see from the diagrams that are put into the map various kinds of fanciful things like sea creatures, what were called flying fish at the time, and some details about the ships that were used. The Dutch, in fact, succeeded in displacing the Portuguese because they had a very much more efficient ship, which could both carry more and be armed with cannons in such a way that they quite literally could blow out of the water the competition from the Portuguese, which they end up doing and come to dominate the trade all along the coast of West Africa. Notice in particular, though, the size and the importance given in these early maps to the offshore islands. In this case, the islands here known as the Cape Verde Islands. It's really staggering. The reason for that is that they're hugely important in the European trade, as are the Canary Islands up here and Madeira. Islands all along the Atlantic coast are first mapped and given a great deal of attention in all of these early maps, because it's there where they can start to experiment with growing various kinds of crops with slave labor force obtained from raiding or trading with populations on the main coast of Africa as a continent. Well, you get the idea. You can start looking at these maps in detail and take segments of them or make comments about the entirety of the Dutch fleet going around South Africa, for example, and making it to Asia to displace the early Portuguese dominance in that part of the world. Well, I'd urge you to experiment with these things and start looking around in the collections of the Library of Congress. After all, as a taxpayer, you paid for this Library of Congress staff and experts who have given you very excellent data about these different maps and make them available in ways that you can cite them very accurately and clearly in these different forms. This is a map by Jodocus Hondius, very famous map, around 1640, when the Dutch were just beginning to displace the Portuguese in many parts of West Africa and South Africa, and indeed over into Asia. So make use of these early maps in the study of Africa. Make use of the local ones that are more precisely in West Africa, for example, like this one here, which has a French text to it, but once again can be zeroed in upon, expanded to a full-page map, and then zoomed in upon very precisely to get local names, local places, an indication of what preoccupied the Europeans in their first approach to the African continent, whether it was down here in Calabar or in the state of Benin or among the Verde over on what was known as the Gold Coast or as they referred to it, Costa d'Oro in this map, or further to the west, something that became known as the Costa de Bonjean, as opposed to the Costa de Malajan, bad people versus good people, an indication not of a place name, but of a judgment about the populations that lived there and were interacting on what was known as the Quaqua Coast, or in the German at the time, Taut Coast, Tooth Coast, Ivory Coast, as it became known. Look at these things in detail, and you'll discover things that no one else has ever spent time to look at, including the indications to the interior of things like the Mele Regnum, which means Mali Kingdom. Now we're learning more and more about medieval kingdoms in Africa. They heard about them on the coast, and they recorded the fact that they existed, not with very precise boundaries. In fact, you should systematically be suspicious of any boundaries written on these early maps because they're all based on hearsay. Nevertheless, there's great information to be obtained here, and usually it's obtained because the Europeans didn't know what they were doing. So they're recording various myths of one kind or another. But before leaving the page like this, you should realize that you can also not just acquire the data, not just acquire the citation down here, but you can actually download these maps. Since these belong to the Library of Congress, that is to the American people, they can be downloaded in various formats. JPEGs of different sizes, GIF files, and a TIFF file, which is much larger and in greater detail, but you can download them to your own computer and start to analyze them in greater detail when you don't have access to the internet. Further, if you're interested in developing curriculum for a class, you can start to use that as the raw material for slideshows and presentations in which you want to emphasize particular things. So make use of these Library of Congress assets, really quite useful, especially this segmentation of the maps in the early works, right up through the 19th century. In the 19th century, obviously, the maps look a lot more familiar and in many respects are far more detailed. A map like this of South Africa, for example, will have a great deal of information in it that can be looked at, again, in enormous magnification. So you can navigate your way around these maps. You can assign different maps to different students or groups of students if you're teaching. Or you can have a research team focused on, say, a range of maps from 1800 to 1850, looking at South Africa, for example. What shows up in the map history of these areas and is recorded in such a way that, as in this case, George H. Walker and Company in Harcourt Street in Boston was the publisher of this map in 1898. Bostonians knew a great deal about Africa at the time and published it in maps like these. So that was a way of looking at the Library of Congress collections. Notice how many you can go in and explore and the different indexes that they have available on the left-hand column to make it easier for you to access different periods and different subject matters. Then try the New York Public Library. Again, the connection will be available for you in the PDF file, and you can just click on it and get right to it. The landing page for the New York Public Library's digital collections and Africa maps looks like this. Once again, you can search through their collections by entering Africa maps in the New York Public Library Digital Collections search engine right here. So if we put in Africa maps and hit search, what you'll get back from the search is this display of various maps. Again, very useful as a way of getting it a range of different particular kinds of maps. Here you just click on the map itself and get right to the digital edition of it. Their zoom function is down here on the left and has to be clicked as a way of getting into the map. And then once again, you can move the map with your cursor held down and maintained in the down position. Your left hand cursor, the left button on your mouse, hold it down and then drag the whole map with it. Very interesting set of representations about, in this case, Guinea, the map of Guinea and what it looks like. You can expand it to some extent, but you'll see here that the digitization has not been done at the same level of detail as the Library of Congress maps. By that I mean the dots per inch in the original file that they photographed is not as refined as the number of dots per inch that the Library of Congress used. This is unfortunate, and it means that you won't be able to see things in as great a detail as with the Library of Congress. But you can see them in a great level of detail that's well beyond just the general continent of Africa. And you can more specifically locate through the metadata that they provide the same kind of identification of the cartographer, the year, and the metadata available. If you scan down here, you can get that information. And if you click Cite this item, you'll get the same range or similar range of different formats. The Modern Language Association format, the APA or American Psychological Association, often used in social science journals or papers, and the Chicago Turabian format here. They even provide a Wikipedia citation, which is interesting in itself. But in addition, like the Library of Congress, you can, in fact, download two different sizes of the image. Further, you can copy the permanent link to it and put that link in your notes and in your paper. You can look at the original scan and you can order an original scan. This is very useful, but make sure you make use of all the metadata that they provided here, including the citation material, because if you're going to use this in publications or in referring students to it while you're teaching, you want to be able to refer to the precise source of the material and its identification with a URL that students can then find on their own. Once again, you can find different maps from different periods and zero in on them, looking for a whole series of different things, including some of the detail that's given in the cartouche, that is the identification of the map at the time. This is a very interesting set of documents that you can start to zoom in upon and study as a matter of art history. This is a representation of the Europeans and Africans interacting in these trading environments. And some of them are very fanciful indeed, with animals, but also circumstances that are indicated that could never have happened in historical time, but are a representation to the Europeans about how trade is done on the coast. Again, the ships offshore are interesting in some of these maps as an indication of the kinds of ships that were operative at the time the map was drawn or conceived by its author. You can get various maps of different periods. They aren't organized in the same kinds of ways that the Library of Congress were by decade or by century, but they are still helpfully organized in a way that you can analyze the maps and get some further information about them. The zoom capacity is different on each map, and as I say, the digital precision of the initial map is not as great in most cases as the Library of Congress map. But a map like this that talks about the slave trade and the internal routes that supplied the slave trade is very interesting to look at in detail when you get a chance, because it'll give you a sense of the extent to which not only was there trade along the coast in slaves, but the impact of that trade far to the interior is mapped on things like this. Now, whether or not these are accurate is something you need to undertake as a question of research. That's the important part of researching these initial documents. These aren't in themselves truth. They're representations of what people on the coast or certain colonial officers or certain merchants thought was going on. But there are lots of reasons why they're misrepresentations, and that's the study of African history. So look at them in detail, learn how to attribute them correctly and cite them correctly, and talk about what they represent and what they don't represent. As this one, in an explanatory note, says at the time of its publication, the map shows the slave hunting or trading areas shaded according to degree of intensity of slave traffic. The red lines indicate the principal routes of the slave ships or caravans and the destination of the slaves. Well, that has to be checked against all other sources. It's not in itself a definitive source. No one source is in history. But a great deal of very interesting material can be obtained in these maps from the New York Public Library. Click on them, explore them as if you're seeing them for the very first time. One of the things you'll realize is that the Europeans had very fanciful ideas of what was going on in the interior, since most of their efforts were focused on the coast. And those fantasies show up on the maps, not because they've been there and mapped it, but because they've heard things and mapped it. This is one of the staggering cases of it here in West Africa. As the course of the 19th century continued, a whole range of mountains start to be diagrammed into the interior of the coastal areas, named as the Mountains of Kong, or the Montagnes de Kong. These don't exist. They're in the imagination of people on the coast who are hearing talk about what is to the interior. There's a region that's indicated as Kong, and there is an attribution to that area in these maps, this one in 1815. It'd be a very interesting study, actually, to trace, and students can do this by looking at these maps, trace when this began to be asserted. Well, the map maker himself died in 1812, but the map wasn't published until 1815. How long before 1812 did the mountains of Kong start to show up in European maps? when did they disappear? When did the Europeans know enough about this region or get different sources to tell them about it that made it clear this was not a mountain chain that went across the whole of Africa? Apparently, in 1815, this was thought to exist. Once again, you can download, get the permanent link, and get the citations in the form that are useful for publications. The item data is here, and the citation material is given, as I said before. You can click on it and get the various forms of its presentation. Cite this item, click on that, you get the MLA form, Chicago Turabian form, and the APA form, as well as this Wikipedia citation. Interesting, if you're writing Wikipedia entries, you can include that as a citation. So, enjoy the New York Public Library's Africa maps, as well as the Library of Congress. Well, that'll show you some of the things in the New York Public. Some things are very good for the maps, but others include things beyond the maps, images and things like that, especially if you truncate the search a bit to drop the word map and look for specific categories, as we tried. Then, of course, you can try the Stanford University libraries, which have a special designation for maps of Africa. Take a look. The landing page for the Africa maps in the Stanford University Library looks like this. And again, it's very easy to navigate. It's perhaps easiest to navigate visually, but you can get around it by looking for topics, authors, dates, and the like. If you just browse it, you can click on the map that you want to get to, and in fact, it will call up the metadata and supporting information. And once again, it has this capacity to zoom in and out. This is a very interesting and important map for the early history of European representations of Africa, because it in fact shows the fanciful nature of the projections on Africa of European misconceptions, in particular the representation of a cyclops, a one-eyed personage that is said to occupy parts of Africa, represented as a cyclops figure seated here down around the Bight of Benin. It actually includes a very interesting representation of a Portuguese ship prior to the arrival of the Dutch, and an early representation of an elephant. In any case, you can see that this early map was more fanciful than anything else, but once again, there's very interesting details on it. The entire continent is basically outlined. The importance of West Africa is emphasized. The existence of the Mali kingdom, as it's indicated, what was known as the medieval kingdom in the interior of Mali, is represented as Mele here. And the existence of the Senegal River is very prominent. This would be something to trace, again, in historical terms. When did the rivers start to be mapped in detail? As well as the islands. The Cape Verde Islands are once again given great prominence here, and marks an indication of their significance, especially for the merchants of the slave trade, where the early plantations are established on these offshore islands before the transatlantic trade gets going to a large extent. So you can see There's various information to be picked up from these maps, even though historically they're quite limited in their accuracy. They're culturally and historically quite important in their representations and misrepresentations. Physical description here, click on more details. This is a map from 1542, so you can see it's well within the Portuguese period of domination in this area. And you can download the information here, close it out as well. So the Stanford collections are really quite interesting in this respect too. You can use, in effect, a running magnifier here to get down to a very granular level of detail, much more than was available in the New York Public Library. You can read the text, if you know the medieval text being referred to here, in Latin or in German. In fact, this, well, it's a good question. I don't even know which language is being used there, but here's where we need the international expertise of people who can read these initial texts that are inserted into the maps. And this is why the African Map Circle will be drawing increasingly upon international seminars to study particular maps between the experts, the historians on the one hand, the cartographers on the other, and the indigenous populations that know the most about the importance and significance of various names being used as place names in different parts of Africa. Once again, the representation of this particular portion of the Guinea coast is frequent in the maps of the 17th, 16th, 17th, and 18th century, because it was this area with its offshore islands that became prominent and dominant in the slave trade period, especially when the Dutch took over from the Portuguese. For that reason, you get an indication here in Dutch of the word coast, Kwaka coast, Gould coast. This is actually a very interesting question. Who are the Bakoris? They appear in early maps, especially in Dutch maps of the time. And then they disappear, or I should say, the name disappears from the map. We have no idea whether the people disappear, and that in itself would be the subject of extended discussion among historians. The presence of a name does not necessarily mean the presence of a people. The names can be of peoples, or they can be of places or animals or distinctive features of geography. This is not at all well understood. The gazetteer of African cartography has not been worked out in any detail and remains as a topic of major interest. The importance of the Benin coast, as it's referred to by the Dutch, Kust van Benin, the coast from Benin, is very interesting, and the interior waterways are indicated here, as are the waterways down by what's known as the Rio Real, later known as Calabar. All of these things can be dated and studied in map after map in a sequence to see when it is that the Europeans, or some of the Europeans, represented in their representations on maps, seem to be aware of certain things and ready to publish them. All of these maps, it should be kept in mind, are based on manuscripts, most of which we don't have any access to and no longer exist in many cases. The maps are printed versions of things which must have been in existence as manuscripts before that, but we have very little understanding of that. Once again, the presence of some of these maps, though, raises some very interesting questions about the nature of the commerce on the coast. And when you can expand them and look into the cartouches that are represented, you can see the representation of some very interesting encounters. In this case, the objects of trade seem to be both ivory, little sacks of gold, and drink of one kind or another between Dutch merchants and local populations. What's being represented here is not a photograph. It's not as if this was a freeze frame of something that was going on. It's a presentation or a representation, as they call it, a representation of relationships of power and of commerce at the time. The indication that elephants were domesticated is problematic. It's not at all clear that elephants in Africa were ever domesticated to the extent that they were in India and Asia more generally. The Dutch were in constant commerce with East Asia and often represented things on African maps that really only existed in Asia. But that in itself is something of considerable interest for historians of the period. So the Stanford maps are quite useful for the study, especially of these illustrations around maps. If you look at the kind of iconography of Poseidon here in the ocean and the various putti that are represented in the cartouche, you can't help but think that these map makers are getting carried away with their artist friends in Amsterdam at the time. But it's a subject of study in itself. What is the meaning of the icons being represented in the cartouche? Well, have a look at the Stanford collection and add it to your topics of interest to study in detail. The details here are given by looking at the side metadata. This was published in 1670 and available in various forms that you can see are cited here, including the description of the title translated into English. The links are available here. The citation material is not immediately available, but you can get access to it again by copying that URL and getting access to it through that form. So have fun exploring the Stanford collection of Africa maps as well. Well, you can see some of the strengths there of the Stanford collection, and they're quite accessible through their own navigation pages. Very useful collection. Then you should go on and try the University of Illinois. They have a longer URL, and it's hard to memorize something that long, but you can click on it again in the PDF file available in the Africa Map Circle website. They've chunked their maps very helpfully into maps of Africa to 1900. In other words, anything before 1900. One of the reasons for this is that there's a very excellent geographer at the University of Illinois who's been teaching there for years, a fellow named Professor Tom Bassett. And his own specialty has looked a lot at maps in the 19th century for the scramble of Africa. Well, the landing page for the University of Illinois' digital collections on Africa looks like this. Maps of Africa to 1900. You can, of course, and should make a more precise search, South Africa, East Africa, West Africa, and you'll see that there's a subset of the total 2,593 items that will come up, and you'll be able to look at that much more easily. Let's look at West Africa and see, for example, that there are 450 items in this, which you can page through page by page. And you can also see a very useful set of locators in the left-hand column. Categories, which indicate different authors or creators of maps, different places of publication, so you can see which ones were published in France, which in Paris itself, which in London, which in Amsterdam, and the Netherlands, the broader category. You can see also the spatial coverage, and here check out to other spaces. We looked at the West African material, but there's also within West Africa a specification of Nigeria, Togo, Dahomey, what's called French West Africa, which would be applicable for the more recent periods of time, and the Niger River area. Then there are keywords you can also click upon. You can also look at German, French, English, Dutch, Latin, or Portuguese maps. Very, very useful. But I want to emphasize here that there are several different repositories. And in particular, because there's been a very strong professor of geography at the University of Illinois for decades, Professor Tom Bassett, he has had a personal collection here of 145 maps indicated in this listing of West Africa that are his own. And he's contributed in some way, at least on a cataloging level, to the university. This is very, very helpful, and it's a very valuable aspect of the University of Illinois' collection of Africa maps. If you click that itself, you can get a sense of which maps he has amassed over the years, including beauties like this 1857 one, which has within it some fantastically realistic, seemingly realistic representations, but at the same time, the kind of fantasies that we talked about earlier in reference to particular parts of West Africa. Let's see if we can call it up as a full screen representation here and see what its strengths are and what its particular weaknesses are. Some of its strengths have to do with a kind of quasi-photographic representation of what's going on the coast. This is an indication of what Sierra Leone looks like from an engraving made on this map of the port of Furo Bay and what the ships looked like out at sea, how they were being attended to by paddlers in canoes. And it's really quite an impressive seascape, landscape of from the sea. Even more impressive is the one that's presented at the top of Christianborg Castle. Quite an interesting vignette in itself, a representation of one of the slaving castles on the Gold Coast, Christianborg as it was known at the time. Now, these quasi-photographic representations like this one here of Cape Coast Castle, really very beautiful and quite significant if you've looked at the different kinds of artistic representations of Cape Coast Castle. You'll realize that the artists quote one another, and in many cases quote this map for their representations. Future discussions of the African Map Circle will make that clear. Now, it would seem that with that kind of precision of engraving, that the map itself would be accurate. And in many respects it is. But in many other respects, it's the replication of the fantasies of the geographers at the time, representing the mountains of Kong here as a chain, when in fact no mountains ever existed in a chain in that part of West Africa or any other part of Africa as the mountains of Kong. There's also an interesting representation of complete emptiness. A lot of detail over here in the Ashanti region, but for this portion of what is now the Central Ivory Coast, total blanks, where there were known to be rivers going to the interior, including the Bandama River, which is well represented in some of the other maps that Professor Bassett has in his collection. So don't be fooled by the quasi-precision and, in fact, pictorial representation of different portions of the coast, and assume, therefore, that the map is far more accurate just because it's more detailed in some areas. What's in fact happening in many cases is detailed representation of ignorance in the case of the mountains of Kong. Again, this is happening by the middle of the century now. If we go out to the metadata on this material and look at how it's being represented here, this is an 1857 map. Remember, we saw an 1815 map drawn in 1812 representing the mountains of Kong. But, you know, basically 42 years later, that has not only not been corrected, it's been represented as even more artistically affirmed. In this case, in an illustrated atlas published both in New York and London. These are part of the fantastic collections of Tom Bassett. It's indicated as part of his personal collection, and you can get access to the URLs on it, and you can even download it. So it's really quite useful to have this kind of information available for you in different kinds of files, including a detailed master file, a TIFF file. So for those of you studying West African history in the 19th century, these collections, particularly those of Tom Bassett at the University of Illinois, are very valuable indeed. Look through these maps one at a time and you'll see that there's a fantastic amount of detail provided, especially for the 19th century. Enjoy it. It's really quite an amazing collection. Once again, make sure you look at the collections that are designated as the Bassett sub-collection within this university library at the University of Illinois, because he's made a point of collecting some very important maps about the scramble for Africa territory in the late part of the 19th century. Then go ahead and try the Northwestern University Library. This is one of the oldest collections in the United States, and it's very valuable in terms of situating some of the maps that we need to get access to and study in detail. The landing page to the Northwestern collection looks like this, and you have to scroll down a bit to be able to refine your search. You can search within the collection if you know a particular name or a date, but you can ask to show filters as well, and the filters will give you an indication of specific kinds of things within the collection. For example, you can click on Creator and get the cartographer behind many of the maps. Jacques-Nicolas Belin, for example, has 3 maps in this collection, and you can see what they are by looking at them directly under his name. Jacques-Nicolas Belin was a cartographer for the service of the Marine of the French during the 18th century, early 18th century, and his maps are really quite detailed. In many cases, he's presenting information that was known from elsewhere, and he's representing it. In some cases, with other languages as well. But in many cases, he's coming up with very interesting original material that deserves some attention. And you can look in with great detail through the Northwestern University map collection to see some very interesting things. Like, for example, these indications of coastal forts with an offshore anchorage point and the fathom depth in those offshore areas, as well as an indication in detail of Fort Frederiksborg, indicated as Danois, Danish. Well, at the time he produced this map, that may well have been the Danish fort, but it was set up initially as a Brandenburg fort. The other forts on the coast are indicated as well, and they're given their national control, like the Fort Hollandais and Dix Cove. Fort Anglois is the way it's put. An English fort down here at Dix Cove. We want to look at this in detail in the future in the Africa Map Circle because every one of these forts becomes quite important. Another English fort here, Orange, Fort Hollandais, Secunda. These are very important place names along what became known as the Gold Coast. And if we look at the attribution in his own sort of handwriting, I should say his printed cartouche, you can indicate and trace the statement in French from the Royaume de Fétou, Royaume de Sabou, Royaume de Commando. These are kingdoms, according to him. And as opposed to countries, pays de 20 ans. There's an indication of a difference between regions and political entities. He's indicated here as ingénieur, ordre de la marine, rue Dauphine, près de la rue Christine in Paris. It's a 1750 map. It was made on the commission from the Secretary of the Department of the Marine. As he says, in order to serve the ships of the king. That's a very interesting period, 1750, and one that you need to look at in detail. But a map like this provides the detail that enables you to look at it very carefully. So these Northwestern University map collections are very interesting for people doing detailed work on the coast of West Africa. Take a look at the larger maps as well. This one is of East Africa by the same cartographer, Belin, and it shows the channel between Madagascar and the east coast of Africa, with an indication again in detail of the importance of the offshore islands, especially from Sofala northwards, and an indication of the control of the island of Madagascar by the French at the time. It's this control of the French that becomes very important for the history, especially the ethnobotanical history of the transatlantic trade, as well as the oceanic trade to India. Maps like this enable you to look back in detail at this whole period and these particular individuals. So look for the filters, look for the different maps of origin, that is, the different creators of these maps. And you'll see some very interesting material represented in the Northwestern University Library. In this case, this small map, but detailed map in West Africa is quite interesting for its representation of the link between what might be called the local trading populations in sailing canoes and the international presence, in this case of the Dutch. You can tell by the flag here, a Dutch ship whose main attribute seems to be that it has a cannon firing out of the back. Now, the cannons firing out of the back of a ship are not very useful to take on canoes, but they are very useful in taking on other European rivals. To maneuver correctly and hit another European rival broadside in their ship with a cannon fired from your rear is very powerful as a military tactic, used all along this coast as the Dutch displace first the Portuguese and then battle the English for control of much of the West African trade. So there's lots to be gained from looking at these things in detail, and in particular, you're going to learn a lot about the importance of these offshore islands, which members of the African Map Circle have talked about at length, particularly this island of Saint Thomé, Ile Saint Thomé. This is so important at the time, initially for the Portuguese and eventually for the Dutch, that it's given a special insert in this map and provided with a great deal of detail. Here's the insert. And you can see it's a very small island, but it has a great deal of precision as to where the forts are. Right here is the main citadel, the fort for defending the island. Its importance was primarily because it was a source of fresh water for all of the sailing ships going to Asia. Well, you've had a chance to look through these university libraries. Now, take a look at one of the most powerful and immediately useful online libraries in the world. This is Afroterra, the Cartographic free library. It's free to anybody who has access to the internet. The address is direct and clear, www.afroterra.org. This is the page you'll be presented with as the landing page for Afroterra.org. It's an amazing map in itself, but it's part of an amazing, truly amazing collection made freely available by a very generous individual who's been collecting maps for decades. It's the Cartographic free library because anyone with internet access can get to it and consult it openly. The first way into the material is by way of these maps, and you can tell that the organizer of this collection is very, very much of a map enthusiast. He leads with these maps and allows you to scroll through a number of them, showing their artistic features as well as their geographic features in all of the things he displays quite artfully. When you've had a chance to look through these, you can click on further detailed material down in the left-hand corner of each of the banner photos by clicking on Map Details. And that will take you out to a different catalog site, a catalog of record for that map. Like this one of a map created in 1482, before the discovery of the New World by Columbus, and posted with great detail about the top of the African continent toward Europe, the Mediterranean coast. Now the details are given here, but if you click on the map, you can get through to view it on a scale normally not possible in any of these map collections. Let's change the view and take a look at how it's done. Here's the new environment in which you can view that map, having clicked on the thumbnail. And you'll see that down below, there's a series of control bars here that are very interesting and very powerful. If you go to full screen, for example, you can, in fact, see this on a full screen. Further, you can start to click on it and move in detail to realize what's been written on the map and what's being signified. Here, there's an intricate knowledge of the river system in the west of Africa, right up to what we came to know as the Dakar coast, and an indication of the importance of these islands as well. It was in the 1460s that the Portuguese settled these islands and began to commerce directly with the mainland of Africa. But the details are recorded in this very early map, and something that can be traced by place names very powerfully. The details of North Africa are very clear because the Portuguese were well aware what was going on in North Africa. Details of Egypt are quite clear, but the whole southern part of the continent is, at this point, a region that was totally unknown because it hadn't been thoroughly mapped by the Portuguese until they went around the coast on their way to India with the trips of Vasco da Gama. You can see the value of enlarging very rare maps like this and analyzing them in detail. If you got access to this map physically, you would never be able to see it in the detail that you can see it now in the digitized form that Dr. Gerald Rizzo has now made available to the world. Some of the most interesting material in the Afroterra collection is not strictly cartographic. It's not maps, but it's the views that went along with the maps and that were published at the same time. Views like this of the slaving castle of Elmina on the Gold Coast. Once again, you can call it up in the catalog and enlarge it. Enlarge it to such an extent that, once again, even if you had seen the original, you would not be able to see the original in the level of detail that Jerry Rizzo has provided here. with a scan that must be at least 600 dots per inch, enabling him to expand a view of this castle so that you can see as, as if it were a painting. These are prints. They've been colorized probably since they were printed initially, but they're very informative, both in terms of the architecture of these massive structures on the Gold Coast and the commercial traffic back and forth under the Dutch flag of canoes, rather large canoes, some with sails, back and forth to the waiting ships. In fact, some of the details of these prints provide an extraordinary vision of what was going on at the time. In this case, it's the slave trade right off of the coast of Elmina. As he puts it here in the title, a prospect of St. George Castle at Elmina. Now he's taking it from Balbo and Dapper. These are two earlier authors, which he's taking the image from and reproducing here. Further, he gives an example, and you can call up from the website in their index, an example of the transport of slaves from the slaving castles, in this case, Manfro, out to the waiting ships. They have little designations on them, like A, and a little indication of the different cargo that are being transported out to the ships. If you look at the indication at the top, it's a prospect of the coast from Elmina to Mari from Barbeau and Smith. And the slaves are being brought out, paddled out by those who are free in the back of the boat. The slaves are in the front of the boat and being taken out to a ship. One of the ships seems to be indicating it's carrying a British flag. We can't tell for sure because the painting was done afterwards, after the print. But as they indicate in the annotations, the A stands for Negro canoes carrying slaves aboard at Manfro, carrying slaves aboard various ships. In this case, the detail is so fine that you can actually look at the insignia on the ship, and it's intended to mean the Sun King or the French King with the French coat of arms up here. Really quite extraordinary. The Sun King is King Louis XIV. And in fact, here are the cannons out of the stern of the ship. And as it indicates in the title, here's the slaves designated as A being paddled out to the ship by others. Now, this is an extraordinary collection that Dr. Rizzo has put together. And it's made even more powerful by the ability to scrutinize it. Look at each one of these local representations of the Cape Coast Castle, San Iago, Elmina. All of these are represented. These are not photographs. They are representations. And this author indicates, in fact, he's taken them from earlier representations by Barbeau and Smith, two sources which should be checked out in detail as well. But I think you can get a sense of how rich this collection of Dr. Rizzo is. Well, you can see it's a very powerful online library for both researching and teaching about Africa. And it's something you want to spend a lot of time in exploring their various assets, including their teaching plans. Their search capabilities are really quite strong. And the bibliographic information, the cartographic information with each map is very useful. Perhaps the most striking detail that is of help immediately to students just getting into this area is the capacity to zoom in on various maps and get a level of detail rarely possible in any other map collection. So you can see some of the immediate advantages of using Afroterra for both research and teaching. But there are a whole series of other things that should be explored as well. One of the things that has to be explored, particularly at this point, is the need to respond to our current circumstance, nationwide and in fact globally. The COVID-19 lockdown has radically altered research, teaching, and learning in African studies at all levels, from K through 12 classrooms through advanced postdoctoral archival research. For the foreseeable future, it will no longer be possible to watch a movie together in a classroom, nor can groups take field trips to museums to view important Africa collections, nor will it be possible to assemble in auditoriums to hear from a visiting guest speaker reporting on current circumstances in Africa. Further, while African studies has had to go virtual almost overnight with online learning, there are so far very few online textbooks that are accessible to assist teachers to design virtual classroom materials and teach under COVID-19 circumstances. Fortunately, online map libraries can help in this circumstance. Both faculty and students can begin now to use these online libraries to build new online curricula for learning and teaching about Africa. This is what the African Studies Association in the United States has recognized, and they're holding a conference next month in which a panel is being presented on this very topic. Online research and teaching with Africa maps. It's being coordinated by myself, Tim Weiskel, but we're very fortunate to have Dr. Gerald Rizzo, president of Afroterra, lead off the discussion on the panel. Then, historian William Warriger from the University of Los Angeles, University of California, Los Angeles, distinguished historian of South Africa, is going to be giving a presentation. Henry Lovejoy from the University of Colorado Boulder is going to be talking as well as his father, Paul Lovejoy, from the Department of History at York University in Canada. Finally, Andrew Apter, the acting head of the African Studies Center and a member of the Department of History at UCLA, will be speaking as well. So there is some help and some hope through the African Studies Association to undertake online research and teaching with Africa maps, looking at tips, techniques, examples, and resources that can be used by people building new curriculum for online teaching of African studies.